Alfred the Great may well be the greatest monarch in the history of England. The worst? Richard the Goat Fucker.
Oh man, it's RFI episode 105. Are you fuckers ready to rock? I said, are you ready to rock?
Ha ha ha!
I could barely hear you. What was that pathetic shit? That's more like it. Alright, this week is Fate's Warning, a band from the 80s. They started in the 80s. They did an album called Night on Brocken that nobody really cares about and they consider it to be a demo. So we're not going to talk about that at all. But towards the early 90s and into today, they've been playing some sort of progressive metal, a kind of which that I am not particularly fond of. It seems like it's a favorite of people that enjoy counting BPMs and fucking telling what keys sweep picks are in and saying stupid shit like Later Enslaved is more progressive than Early Enslaved, even though Early Enslaved is much more structurally complex and doesn't use verses and choruses like the later stuff. But the later stuff, it's got clean vocals and, you did like a mellotron sometimes. That means it's progressive. Necrophagist fans. That kind of dork. I fucking hate those nerds.
Get those nerds!
But then there is the second and third Fate's Warning albums, which have John Arch on vocals. He's also on that first one that's more of a demo. Second and third ones really established them as one of the leaders of the progressive metal movement. They were seen as sort of a rival to Queensryche, but I think Queensryche is for fucking nerds! Miss me with that rock opera shit. Not terribly interested in that kind of stuff. But those second and third Fate's Warning with John Arch on it, those are really good. But the fan base for those albums, quite a big portion of it is probably even worse than, the more innocent nerdery of later Fate's Warnings fans. The early stuff, you get these bizarre metal archive elitist types. The kind of people that get a little bit too excited about every new Slough-Fag album. Kind of people that say stupid shit like, the second Scum album would actually be a much better entry point into death metal for a melodic death metal fan than early In Flames. Just like weird fucking trend hoppy people. The kind of people that all got into Argoslint around like 2007. And then the cognitive dissonance of them being, oh god, racist, made them all jump ship at the exact same time. People that are very much into seeming like they're unique, even though they all have the exact same disgustingly safe opinions. Fucking nerds. No, not our listeners. Our listeners are wonderful people, I'm sure. I'm positive, alright? Hashtag Jub is positive. But whatever. This week, we're going to be talking about the first Ray Alder Fate's Warning album. See, Fate's Warning kind of had pretty much the same lineup forever through most of the 80s. They had Frank Aresti and Jim Matheos, the main composers on guitar. Got Joe DiBiase on bass and Steve Zimmerman on drums, but they had John Arch on vocals for most of the 80s, and eventually he was working a full-time job. He didn't want to give that up, so he had to leave the band, and they got Ray Alder, whose real name is Ray Balderrama. Hey, you fucking fucks. East Coast, whatever, except it says he was born in Texas. I don't even know what I'm talking about. Anyways, they got a new vocalist, Ray Alder, and they also considerably changed their sound. I'm not sure if the sound changed because of the new vocalist or the new vocalist had to adopt a new style compared to John Arch because of the change in direction of the music. But whatever it was that happened, radical departure from their early stuff. And because of that, this album is not really looked upon fondly by either side of the nerdy portions of the Fate's Warning fan base nowadays. It's not fluffy and cerebral enough for the kind of people that'll listen to something like that FWX album, and it's not as power metal-y as their early stuff. It doesn't have the riffs, bro, like that all the Slough-Fag nerds are into. By the way, I actually do like Slough-Fag, and early Fate's Warning is fucking amazing, and I might do an episode on that stuff at some point. But today, we're talking about No Exit, sort of the weird bastard stepchild of the Fate's Warning back catalog. It's named after a Jean-Paul Sartre play, also called No Exit, from which we get the phrase, hell is other people. And in this case, they've taken the idea of that play, which was you have three people that are locked in a room in hell, and they sort of torture each other to death through their own ability to move on from their own sins. The Fates Warning album takes that idea and then expands to that sort of interpersonal hell to encompass all of the late 80s consumer-driven society. Jean-Paul Sartre, of course, is notable as an early 20th century French existentialist who happened to look exactly like Gothic King Cobra for some reason.
What's up, fellow YouTubers?
Despite the fact that this album is overlooked by a lot of modern-day Fates Warning fans, it was actually their biggest selling album of all time. It had their longest continuous chart presence, and if you were to talk to older metalheads from the 80s...
He says, how old are you then, old man?
This is basically the Fates Warning album. It's the one that they all remember. And yeah, it's pretty good. I want to say one of the guys from Sepultura said he thought it was the best of its genre, that being this kind of progressive metal. But to understand how radical it is compared to older Fates Warning, we need to know what older Fates Warning sounded like. So those are John Arch's completely inimitable vocals. He sounded like nobody else. And his melodic lines are as complex, if not more so, than the very flowing melodic guitar lines under it. He's big into overlaying himself sort of a choral effect. And overall, the music has a very flowing melodic feel to it. Some more of that vocal layering. And they use these palm-muted riffs. But despite the fact that it's palm-muted, it's not really thrashy. It's more flowing and melodic. I wonder if this kind of stuff wasn't an influence on later bands like Argus Slent. Certainly Twisted Tower Dire. That's what ye olde Fates Warning sounded like back in the day. That would be off of their third album. But this one, the fourth album, No Exit, completely different beast. This album is unmistakably thrashy, which I am a big fan of. It's produced by the same guy that did Rust in Peace, as a matter of fact. But there's a heavier reliance on very chuggy palm muting. This riff right here is one of the most brutal thrash metal riffs of all time, and yet it's on this progressive power metal album. Absolutely great riff. This is the kind of stuff that Testament wishes they could write, but they're too busy being nerds.
Get those nerds!
So here comes the vocals. He's just as acrobatic as John Arch, but instead of singing and kind of intertwining it with the music, the riffs are so spastic that he has to sort of sing across it and over and under it, just do a lot of modulation, shifting his pitch around, somewhat comparable to the difference between Ozzy's approach to singing in Black Sabbath and Dio's. Let's see what happens later in the song.
안녕하세요, 트와이스입니다.
Now that was a heck of a fast forward. But here we get into how amorphous the song structures on this album are. This is almost like a second little mini song that happens before the end of the actual song. It exists outside of the normal verse-chorus paradigm, and yet it is at this point that the song title itself comes up in the lyrics. This weird little mini song that happens towards the end of the main song. Right around now. And that's the name of the song, everybody, Anarchy Divine. First song on this fourth album, apart from a weird kind of spooky choral intro that only goes on for like 5 seconds, so it's not terribly worth mentioning outside of the album's concept, which of course is that whole hell is other people against 80s corporate soullessness. Basically a much more verbose and complex take on the standard thrash metal mindset of the time. Early Fates Warning had a lot of interesting stuff with acoustic sections, intros, outros, and segues. On this album, we got some similar stuff like that, but the division between like the more cleanly done parts and the very thrashy, brutal parts is a lot more start-stop. For instance, In a Word, the name of this song, which features these kind of cleanly sung verses with a very reverbed out guitar parts strumming through chords. They're reverbed out, but they're also very sharp. Again, I have to compliment the production of this album. And then when you get to the chorus of the song, you have these pretty heavy bludgeoning riffs, and his vocals shift from that very smooth, soulful sound to shrieky power metal stuff. This guy is a very underrated vocalist, Ray Alder. At least people seem to recognize John Arch nowadays. Back in the day, I remember he was getting a lot of hate for his vocal styles. Hopefully a similar renaissance can happen for Ray Alder's vocals in this album. Those weird floaty chords are another new innovation for this album. This kind of chord usage seems to be the sort of thing that Coroner would be doing years later in the 90s. I like how they mix up this kind of like shimmery chord with the heavy palm-muted thrash metal riff. Interesting contrast, the fact that it happens all in sort of like the same little melodic chunk of the song. There's no real division between these two guitar styles, they all just sort of exist together. And then we get into a much more martial take on an older Fates Warning trope, that sort of a rising, darkened thrash riff. If this kind of stuff doesn't scream mid to late 90s death to you, I don't know what will. This weird, bass-led, bizarre, dissonant riff collection with an odd-tempo drum beat under it. Gotta think this kind of stuff was highly influential in later bands. And then it leads back into a slightly more normal-sounding thrash riff. The centerpiece of this album is the song The Ivory Gate of Dreams, which is 20 minutes long, but on pretty much every CD version of the album it's divided into, like, I think 6 or 7 kind of mini-song sections. I've seen it compared to Rush's 2112, but would you believe this one's actually a lot better than that? This is one of my favorite metal songs of all time. It starts with an acoustic intro that introduces a leitmotif that is then referred back to later on in the song in different forms. More of those sharp, icy acoustic sounds from the producer. Perfectly done. I think the really sharp tone of the acoustic guitars and that absolutely reverb-heavy snare date this album, but are also excellent. But this is the melody that you're going to be hearing later on towards the middle of the song and in the end of the song when it climaxes. The title Ivory Gate of Dreams is actually a reference to the Aeneid. When Aeneas goes into the underworld, he sees real and false dreams coming out of gates of ivory and horn. And so this song is about dreams when you're sleeping, but also broken dreams. Just kind of general psychological type stuff. Very cool stuff.
Very cool.
And really nice thrash metal riffs that transition surprisingly well into a resurgence of that triumphant melody. Oh, it's so good. If you don't like this part, I don't know what to tell you. Like, this fucking melody is amazing. And it's really cool to see it being played on electric after it was introduced in that acoustic part like 20 minutes ago in the song. Fucking mind-blowing. And what's also cool is that they finally give it a counterpoint. Once you get to the end of this winding melodic phrase, of course. Really good vocals here. And I think this sort of like melodic staircase riff probably influenced the second Amorphous album quite a bit. I hear shades of Black Winter Day and this sort of thing, but in a more 80s context. Just really sad, sort of pay into broken dreams and illusory reality through a mythological Roman epic poetic lens. So all of that has my name written all over it. That is my jams, and this is one of my favorite albums. I think I featured it on the thrash metal episode of Metal Up Your Fash, if you ever listen to that one. And that about does it for this Fates Warning album. I might do an episode on the John Arch albums just because I like those a lot, and there is quite a bit of meat to chew on there. But for now, I will bid you adieu, and I'll see you around next week, hopefully.
Toot beep beep honk, toot beep honk beep, toot beep honk beep, honk beep beep, toot honk beep, toot beep honk.